Jr., Vice President of the Geologists of Jackson Hole, and again, for Mr. Willott, welcome here. We're very fortunate for lots of things in this life, but one is that Camp Davis resides right down the road, and as Adam was telling me here, they're doing an alumni thing, a 90th anniversary alumni event right now. So we're fortunate to have Adam Simon here from the University of Michigan, who is the Arthur Thurnau Professor of Earth and Environmental Sciences. He does teach pretty much every summer down at Camp Davis. He has a master's in science from Stony Brook University, a bachelor's and a PhD from the University of Maryland. He is a professor of economic geology, which is a field of study that focuses on the understanding of processes by which nature forms mineral deposits. In other words, things that we would not exist without, truly, probably literally. Many of the things in this room would not be here without those mineral deposits. So, for mineral deposits which are embedded in every aspect of modern life. And that is something that, if nothing else, you should take away from Adam's talk here tonight. So his research group combines experiments from the field and laboratory work and working to understand the chemical and physical processes that affect basically how these kinds of elements concentrate in places of the earth, rich enough so that it's worthwhile to extract them. So without further ado, I'm going to ask you to join me in welcoming Dr. Adam Simon.
All right, so thank you very much for the introduction. I think I can walk around. Yep. Okay? If it becomes distracting for you, just let me know. So I'm going to start with the first slide, which is my family, and a set of photographs around the photograph of my family that give you a sense of who I am outside of academia. I love NPR. We have 2 vehicles, combustion engines. I love to travel. My younger daughter plays field hockey. My older son plays soccer. I love classical music. I love opera, which my kids despise. I love my Mac for PC users. That's okay. I love my iPhone. I love the electricity that allows these to work, including the airplane, because all of us now when we fly, isn't it amazing that you can charge in the air? And it used to be you had to make sure you had something separate to charge your phone when you were flying because you killed the battery in a couple of hours. I love hot water, love taking showers. Love air conditioning, love heat. I grew up in North Carolina in a 1,000-square-foot house with no air conditioning, which my kids still don't believe that someone could do. And I tell them that my mom used to miss the sheets on really hot, humid nights. Right? How many people? Yeah, I heard a lot of people, right? That used to be a thing. You missed the sheets, you lay under the sheet, oh boy, it actually pulls the heat away from your body. My kids roll their eyes at me and think that's some sort of, dark ages. So this is who I am. I'm not preachy. And I want to walk through tonight, and following up on the introduction, I want to set the stage initially for where we are in 2019. I think as a human in 2019, despite the problems, and there are clearly problems around the world as well as local, I think it's the best time to be a human ever in the history of humanity. And I think that's because of our ability as humans to find resources, to extract them from the earth, and to use them to improve our lives, okay? No matter where you are. I've been fortunate to do research on 7 continents. I've visited about 60 countries. I've seen unbelievable poverty, much worse than I remember as a kid who grew up on and off welfare and free lunch. Okay? But still today, what we have access to is amazing. Okay? When you compare it to where we were not that long ago, and not that long ago we were in the Stone Age, and every resource that we used, you can see in the photograph, minus the animals that we would have killed, but you can see some of the bones there that are the result of killing those animals. So we had clothes and we had shoes and we had meat to eat. And it was that consumption of meat, no offense to vegetarians, but it was that consumption of meat that allowed our brains to change faster than other species in the animal kingdom, so that we ended up climbing to the top of that pyramid. And if you go from this and walk through our use of resources, you read the Old Testament, there are what we call the 7 metals of antiquity. And here they are: gold, copper, silver, tin, lead, iron, and mercury, along with the approximate year that we think humans first started using them for actual purposes. Not just as ornaments, but we used them because they allowed us to build tools. They allowed us to build objects. We use them in warfare. So we go from the 7 metals of antiquity, okay, in the Old Testament that started to change humans forever. And we did that by recognizing natural resources at the time as they existed on the surface of the earth. So here we have an example of native copper. So we have native copper here. Okay, nice shiny penny. And then this is that classic green patina that you either get by having a copper roof put on your house and waiting 20 years, or you pay somebody to age that roof very rapidly so it looks like your roof is 20 years old, despite the fact that your house was built last year. And if we look at this copper and we look around the world, there's evidence that humans were using copper thousands of years ago in Europe, in Asia, in Australia, in the United States. And importantly, it was all native copper. So it was all copper that we had to find that looked like this on the surface. We didn't have the ability to extract copper from minerals where the copper was bonded with other elements. So if we go to a place called Great Orme in England, this is what it looks like now if you go there. You see these holes, and those holes into the rock are tunnels. And the tunnels were built by humans thousands of years ago for the purpose of extracting native copper. And humans figured out how that native copper was there by looking at that green patina on the surface where nature, by rainfall falling on that native copper, produced that beautiful green patina. And so humans said, wait a minute, we see this green patina. If we dig into the rock, we can find native copper that has not been oxidized. And that native copper we can use as tools, as currency, and other things because it's very malleable so we can make it into the shapes that we want. All from just seeing color change. That's all we needed. And for thousands of years, the resources such as copper that we found were simply that. You'd see a green patina, whether you were the Inca Empire in South America, whether you were Aboriginals in Australia, whether you were Native Americans in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and that was the telltale sign that that patina meant there was native copper at or almost at the surface. That was a key. So this was a really important clue. And we have evidence that the Romans and the Greeks were trading in this copper thousands of years ago. Okay, so that native copper put that place on a map. We then had the invention of smelting. So we're using copper for at least 1,000 years. And then the Sumerians, and some people argue other ancient societies, they figured out that you could take the metal copper, which melts at a very high temperature, and you could mix it with the metal tin, which melts at a very low temperature, and you could literally grind those two together. You could put them into a fire, and what's shown here in the clay tablet is the Sumerians blowing oxygen into the base of the charcoal fire so it could achieve higher temperatures. And by mixing about 8 parts copper and 2 parts tin, you produce a liquid, and when that liquid solidifies, it makes an alloy that we call bronze. And that took us from the Copper Age to the Bronze Age. And everybody wanted bronze because bronze is harder than copper. So if I have a military that uses bronze, and you have a military that uses copper, all things being equal, I will win because my tools are stronger and superior to your tools. So this ancient metallurgy that literally took us originally from the Stone Age with copper, and now we're changing copper and tin to produce bronze relatively rapidly in the span of human history. And it put places on the map. So today, when I'm coming here and I forgot exactly where the library was, I just whip out my smartphone and I don't even have to touch it anymore, right? Hey Siri, where's the Teton Library? And it puts a place on the map. When I look at ancient maps like this, and we see all of these symbols here, silver, copper, tin, copper, each of those places, prior to the Copper Age and prior to the Bronze Age, we effectively had no use for those places. But once we entered the Copper Age, we wanted to find copper. Once we entered the Bronze Age, we needed both copper and tin. And so exploration, economic geology exploration, goes back thousands of years when the Romans and the Greeks and the Hittites and the Assyrians and the Sumerians had to start fanning out to find those resources. Because we know that resources everywhere are finite in that volume of the earth. And so when I exhaust all of the copper in this volume of earth, I have to find another volume of earth with that copper. And so it was the dawn of economic geology because we had to find new resources and we had to put new X's on the map where we could source those resources. The Greeks, there's evidence that they had copper from Cyprus and other locations in and around the Mediterranean, but they rapidly exhausted tin. So the mineral from which we extract tin is cassiterite, and the Greeks, their name for England and the English Isles was the Cassiterides, because the Greeks used both overland routes, and there's also evidence that they used ships out through the Straits of Gibraltar, around what is now Portugal and France to England, and they would source their tin. They would source their tin from up here, and then transport it back to Greece, where they would mix it with copper to produce bronze. And this gave them military superiority and allowed the Greek Empire to flourish. Phenomenal. In the span of only a couple thousand years. Then we took a hiatus from those 7 metals of antiquity. And it took us until about the 13th century for scientists to start figuring out how to take minerals that contain many metals, bonded together, and physically separate those metals so that we had individual metals in what we now think of as the periodic table, but that was still hundreds of years in the future. So we go to the 13th and 14th century, and we start figuring out how to purify arsenic and antimony and zinc and bismuth. 15th century was a wash. In the 16th century, we figured out how to extract platinum as a metal from the sulfides in which it was contained. And then we started to get really smart. Our brains really started to figure this out, and modern geology and chemistry started allowing us to produce all of the elements from the minerals in which we find them. So the 18th century, we discovered these metals. The 19th century, we start rounding out the periodic table, okay? And putting all of these elements into that periodic table that we now know. In the 20th century, we finish it out, okay? So we went from the Stone Age to the Copper Age to the Bronze Age, skipped the Iron Age, we went to the Iron Age. And then we went into the 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, and we rounded out the periodic table as we know it today. And what have we done with these resources? This is something that I can tell you when I was K to 12, nobody ever really contextualized the periodic table the way that I learned it as an adult when I had to self-teach it, and the way I try to teach it to students. So it's not just that we have this periodic table, and it's got a bunch of elements, and we know protons and neutrons and electrons, right? That's not really what I think is important for people to understand. It's what have we done with these resources that makes 2019, in my opinion, the best time to be a human. Right? Well, over the last few hundred years, everybody here is aware of the Industrial Revolution. Right? We figured out how to create machines by putting these resources together to do the work that we used to do, effectively replacing manual labor only a few hundred years ago. Ben Franklin and others figured out this thing now that we call electricity that is ubiquitous almost everywhere on the planet. Right? But this is figuring out something that nature had clearly been doing since the dawn of time, but now we can figure out how to harness that electricity. Then we have Edison and others figure out how do we take that electricity and make these crazy things called light bulbs that allow us, at the end of the day when it gets dark, when we're supposed to go to sleep, now we can flip a switch, and all of a sudden, day never has to end. And now we can illuminate our nights using these light bulbs. Once we had light bulbs, we needed electricity to power the light bulbs. So in the early 1880s, Edison and colleagues, they built and patented the first coal-fired power plant. First one in the world. Okay? One in London, and quickly one in New York. And the reason that coal-fired power plants took off was coal was and still is an abundant resource. And it was this singular event in 1893 at the Chicago World's Fair or World Exposition, where there were 100,000 light bulbs strung up around the area. And after night fell, the sun completely set, President Cleveland flipped a switch and all the light bulbs instantaneously lit up. And even in black and white, that makes an amazing photograph. And as soon as that hit the presses around the developed world at the time, every single person said, I want that. And so in tandem, you had the proliferation and growth of coal-fired power plants because they're relatively easy to build. They're pretty quick to flip a switch and produce electricity. And you now had electric light bulbs that everyone wanted. So humanity changed almost overnight in the span of about a decade following this event. Okay? And this is our world at night now. Right, so if you go back to 1850, 1860, your world at night was dark, unless you had fire, unless you had whale oil, unless you had kerosene, which at that point in time was a relatively new invention that we could actually distill kerosene from oil. And overnight, in the span of decades, this is what our world became. And now we can essentially look at the lights on the map here, and we can also evaluate socioeconomic conditions around the world. You know, one of the ones that I've always found interesting is when you look over here. Look at South Korea at night versus North Korea at night. Okay? Stark contrast. South Korea went from a developing country, circa World War II, to a first world country in the span of 2 generations. And South Korea is still rooted in antiquity for political reasons. So overnight, this is how our world changed. Okay? We then had things like the invention of the automobile. So if you stare here, okay, what's everybody driving? Horses. Okay? Say it louder.
What are they shoveling?
So tremendous numbers of horses. And imagine the public health crisis, because every night, all of that night soil had to be shoveled and removed. So the next morning, when the horses came out and the pedestrians came out, it wasn't a public health crisis. And if you look carefully, you can see right there is, I think, the only combustion engine vehicle in the entire photograph. There's no horse, and you can see the front end is an engine, and there's a steering wheel, and there's no windshield because windshields had not been invented. I think windshields as we know them were invented in the 20s and 30s, the singular windshields that cover the front of the car. So this is 1900, okay, which is in all reality not that long ago. New York City. Henry Ford starts mass producing the automobile around this time, and this is 1913, only 13 years later. And I show this, one of the things I want you to take away is how almost instantaneously technology, in the case of a car, completely replaced the mode of transportation that humans at that time, certainly middle class, that humans had been using for decades to hundreds of years. No one by 1913 wanted a horse and carriage, unless you were at the Plaza Hotel and thought it was romantic to go through Central Park. Everyone wanted an automobile because it allowed you to get from point A to point B faster. Okay? Think about farming. And my father just turned 80, and he grew up on a potato farm in New York. There are no potato farms in New York now. But he remembers, born in 1939, by 1944-45, his father buying a tractor. And how revolutionary that was. And it's embedded here. So if we only think about grain, okay, it used to take 25 men a full day, dawn to dusk. Wake up in the morning, the sun is up, come back in when the sun is going down. Dawn to dusk to harvest and thresh a ton of grain. How many people have been to a farm recently and seen this? Today we have combines that you can pre-program their route. Okay? GPS, satellite navigation, air-conditioned and heated, AM/FM satellite radio. You could probably just kick back, put your feet up on the dashboard, and take a nap, and it will do in 6 minutes what it used to take 25 men to do, give or take 100 years ago. And to me, that's progress. That's amazing progress, that we have been able to take resources and build these combines to do what we used to do. And just a snapshot here to show you that one result of that is the number of horses that we use on farms has plummeted, and the number of tractors has increased. Nobody chooses today to farm with a horse or a mule if you have the option and you have the economic ability to buy a tractor. So it put tractors on the map, and now horses are, for most of the time, for ranchers to use to get across large areas if they don't use ATVs or helicopters or airplanes or drones, okay? Or they're for pleasure. Other inventions, and this is one that throws students for a loop. So I'll just put up here these two maps. Okay? The left is just the mid-Atlantic to northeastern United States, and the right is Long Island. Okay? Does anybody see a word on the right map that was the last name of a person who invented something about 1950 that for everyone in this room now is just ubiquitous? Levitt. Levitt was the last name of a gentleman who ideated Levittown, or what became Levittown. Right? So we, in essence, created the concept of suburbia as we now know it. Cities were overcrowded, GIs were coming back. They didn't want to go live in mom's house and dad's house. They didn't necessarily want to live in the same town they had grown up in. And Levitt said, let's build neighborhoods for them. Let's build these houses, which can be affordable by government-backed loans through the Federal Housing Administration. And let's allow all of these GIs and their spouses and their families to live in Levittown. And what happened after Levittown was created? Every other major city around the country said, we want that. And so the neighborhood that my wife and I and kids live in today, cookie-cutter neighborhood, from the air looks just like that. The only difference today is that these homes, they didn't come standard with HVAC and air conditioning. They didn't come standard with multiple bathrooms. Okay? So we've just upscaled and upsized these homes. But this was an invention. And kids in my college classes, 18, 19, 20, for whom this has been their entire lives, I want them to think about that and what it has done for us as a species that has allowed us to move out of cities, which were at that time increasingly overcrowded. There were public health problems. It allowed us, and this was probably not something that Levitt dreamed, it allowed us to also have to invent push lawnmowers and spend part of your weekend mowing your lawn. But again, it's all resources encapsulated in everything you see. If we look then at that period of time, 1960, so we're looking 1960 through 2013, and that's the timeline on the bottom axis here. If we take 1960 as the baseline of zero, so imagine you were alive in 1960 and you used no steel. This shows you the growth in steel consumption since 1960. And we currently use, year over year, about 300% more steel annually than we as a species used in 1960. And steel is mostly iron, mixed with some carbon, and depending on the type of steel, it can have other elements in it. But steel requires mining of iron ore. So in tandem, when we use steel to produce our built environment, that requires that on the other end of that supply chain, there's a mining company that's extracting iron ore and making that available for the steel that we use for, among many things, the New World Trade Center in New York City, which my wife took our kids up on last year, and I stayed at the bottom and had a beer. I was nervous enough just looking up at it. 105 floors with one elevator that doesn't stop and apparently moves really fast. Okay, so this is our increased use of steel in only the last 60 years. Take something like copper. Every one of those homes was connected to the electrical grid. The electric grid is a combination of copper and aluminum for high voltage lines, long distance transmission, steel, because we have to elevate all of those electric lines. Then when we bring them into our neighborhoods, we have to bury them so that we don't have the electric lines above grade so they can't be damaged during storms. We currently also consume a little more than 300% more copper now than we did in 1960. All of the things in which copper is either embedded or all of the things that plug into copper, and copper is used to transmit that electricity. Lithium. is one that's in the news all the time now. Lithium is used to make lithium-ion batteries, right, which are in our phones, in our laptops. Lithium-ion batteries are also used to power electric vehicles. So when we look at an electric vehicle like the one shown here, the reason that they can move is that we have pushed electrons into those batteries, and then we discharge those as we move from A to B. And we can see that over the last 60 years, some ups and downs initially in the 60s and 70s, but we currently consume about 400% more lithium annually than we did in 1960. I think in 1960, it's safe to assume that no one could have ever imagined a fleet of Teslas. And there were other electric vehicles that we now drive. Okay? Rare earth metals, which are embedded in all the technology products that we use, that laptop, your smartphone, your TV screens at home. In 1960, again, my father was a chemistry major, 1960 to 64. He knew what rare earth elements were, but it was only to regurgitate the chemical properties on a test, because he didn't have anything that contained rare earth metals. We now use between 5,000 and 6,000% more rare earth metals than we did in 1960 for a whole variety of uses, right? Not just our smartphones, but night vision goggles. So yttrium, which is geochemically, it behaves as a rare earth element. Yttrium allows us to have night vision. So rare earth elements have been in the news recently. They were in the news today because China controls 95% of the market. And the Department of Defense is increasingly concerned about the trade war between the US and China, because the Department of Defense is responsible for give or take 8 to 10% of all the rare earth elements that we import into our country. So when we think about our men and women in uniform, their ability to defend our country and to defend democracy around the world depends on a sustainable, consistent supply of rare earth metals. And so it has really piqued the interest of Trump and many other people in his administration to think about where we get these rare earth metals. And the article today was about Trump's recent proposal to buy Greenland from Denmark. Because in Greenland, there, as best we can tell, are a phenomenal amount of rare earth minerals in rocks that could be extracted, and then we could use those. So we pick up our modern cell phone, right? We had these metals of antiquity in the Old Testament. When you pick up your modern cell phone, your modern smartphone, there are about 60 elements that are physically part of that smartphone. And about 83 non-radioactive elements in the periodic table. So we're roughly 2/3 of all the elements in the periodic table is what makes our smartphone work. Truly amazing in the span of only, give or take, a few decades. Okay? And if we compare top left, a map I showed a little while ago, the Greeks going to what were for them the Cassiterides, modern-day England, to source that tin. And all they were doing is mixing tin and copper to produce bronze. Compare that to the top right. Top right shows us modern supply chains around the world. At any given time, there are 50,000 container ships around the world. And each one of those container ships is moving goods from one country to another. And if you ever go to a port, they operate 24/7, 365. All of these get offloaded, they get put onto trucks, those trucks drive them away. New truck pulls in, another flatbed gets loaded, that truck drives away. So this is at a port where I spend some time every summer in Takoradi, which is in Accra, Ghana. And Ghana is a developing country, and they are rapidly importing all of the things that we have become accustomed to, but they are increasingly desirable to have what we have. And it's fascinating when I take students there, you just stand and you watch. And just think about how a few thousand years ago, it was a few dozen, maybe a few hundred ships that were traveling around the Mediterranean, moving resources from England back to Greece or around the Roman Empire in North Africa. And today we've got 50,000 container ships at any moment in time doing the same thing on a much larger scale. So what are the results of our resource use? And this is something I think every news channel should spend more time on. We've become too accustomed to, if it bleeds, it leads. I'd love more good news. So here are a few slides about the good things that have resulted from our use of these resources. If we look at the number of women who die during childbirth, it's plummeted. And that's all a function of modern medicine. Okay? Modern hospitals that have technology that is made available because of the resources that we extract from Earth. And so maternal mortality has plummeted around the world, even in the developing world. It's not zero, but if you compare it to what it historically was, it is really low. Child mortality. We read in the 13, 14, 1500s, 1600s, so-and-so would have 10 kids, but 5 of them would die before the age of 5. Right? All of these diseases, all of these things that they suffered from as young children, that for the most part today, certainly everywhere in the developing world, they don't suffer from those diseases. So child mortality has significantly declined. Everyone in here is aware that life expectancy has gone up. So everywhere around the world, no matter where you look, except for a few countries in sub-Saharan Africa owing to the AIDS epidemic, life expectancy has increased. Calorie consumption is among the reasons for that. So malnourishment has plummeted. We have available more calories, more food, not necessarily the best calories, but we have more calories available on average everywhere around the world. Okay? This is one I like because in 1900 we had roughly 1 billion people on the planet. And many of those billion people on the planet lived in extreme poverty. They lived a subsistence lifestyle. Right? I remember when our oldest daughter, who turned 21 a few months ago, when we read her Little House on the Prairie books, and they would talk about how every now and then there was store sugar. And what was store sugar? It wasn't always in the store. There would have to be a shipment come in, and then there would be sugar. And if Nellie's family didn't get it, then maybe Laura's family would get it. Right? Today we go to the store, and there's an overabundance of food. So in the last 120 years, we've added 6 billion people to the planet, and all 6 billion of those people do not live in poverty, which to me is pretty amazing. Poverty in the U.S. is declining significantly. Okay? And again, it's not perfect, it's not zero. There are areas where we have greater amounts of poverty, but on average everywhere, poverty has declined significantly. Okay? Social spending. Right? Something else that is a byproduct of resource extraction, resource consumption, and the trade that goes along with that, and the taxes that that generates. And in the state of Wyoming, I don't have to preach that message. But our ability to use those revenues for social spending has also increased almost everywhere around the planet. Right? The concept of Social Security, the concept of Medicare, that today for us is something we would never want to see go away, that was a new idea in less than a century. And we have the resources to make that reality. Just a quick snapshot in the center there, things that we have discovered, the collective we, in only the past 100+ years, that we don't suffer from anymore because we can immunize children so that they don't get a variety of diseases that used to be primary causes of the death of children before the age of 5. We drive a lot more now than we did in 1900. We went from horses to cars. We make cars safer year over year. Okay? Seat belts, airbags, crumple zones. Every year when new cars come out, they are safer than the previous year's cars. And so despite the fact that we're driving more miles, we have fewer people who die in car accidents. Not zero, but proportionally fewer. Same thing with air travel. I would love to fly. But every time I sit down on an airplane, I'm comforted knowing that on average, the number of people who fly in total, relative to the number of people who die in an accident, is very few. And again, it's all based on technology. Weekly work hours. We went from the Industrial Revolution, creating the steam engine, to do the work that we used to do manually. All of this has resulted in only a few hundred years in reducing the number of hours that we collectively have to work in the developed world. And this one is really important because I'll show you, it also leads to more free time, more discretionary time, and more social time with friends and family. It also has changed the types of work that people do. So this is a photograph of a painting at the Baltimore Museum of Art on the Johns Hopkins University campus in Baltimore. And it's meant to convey the change from a time when all of the metal tools that we used were manually made by a blacksmith. And blacksmiths were slowly put out of business because we could build factories and make those tools faster and better and cheaper than a blacksmith could. So we saw this transition in the labor force. If anyone in here is over the age of 65, one of the things we also know, and I'm hoping that I'm on this slide in 18 years, is that we know the number of hours per week that we have to work, or that we have to work at all as we get older, has decreased. And that's a function of the revenue that we can make while we're working, but also a function of social spending that allows people to retire at 65 and have trust that there will be medical care for them, and trust there will be Social Security income there for them. Okay? The amount of money we have to spend on necessities has decreased. And so there, we're separating the amount of money we spend on Starbucks, which is not a necessity, versus the amount of money we're spending on our heating bill, our electric bill, our water bill. Right? Proportionally, we now have a lot more disposable income. And we see that based on the lifestyles that we and our children and our grandchildren lead and will lead. And then this is one that looks really busy. But I'm going to break it down because I want you to see a couple of things. This bold line here is housework. And if we go back to the turn of the last century, on average, think about things that were housework in your home. Think about doing laundry in 1900. Think about cooking in 1900. Think about having meat available in 1900. We, on average, would work 50 to 60 hours a week just doing the household work that was necessary to keep the house going. And what you can see is that over the last 100 plus years, we have significantly decreased the number of hours that we spend doing housework from about 60 to about 20. And that is because of all of these other things here, like electricity, which we started to mass produce and make available around the turn of the last century. We invented the washing machine. We invented the vacuum cleaner. We invented the stove. We invented the dishwasher. We invented the microwave oven. And all of these inventions did the labor that we used to do, and they did it much faster. And in reality, they did it much cheaper than the cost of our own human labor. And they allowed us to spend our own human labor doing other things or doing nothing. So if we look at leisure time, okay, men somehow always win out. And all the women in here know that's a fact. But if we look at leisure time, the invention of all these tools have allowed us now to have more time to spend doing leisure activities, not doing laundry by hand or cooking by hand over a fire. In only a blink of an eye relative to all of human history. So, in Wyoming, coal was put on the map, interestingly, because the Republicans under Nixon created the EPA and the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. That's a whole other talk, okay, that I tell Republicans they should own, because they actually were the party that put those laws into effect. So, where do I want to take the next 15 to 20 minutes? Okay? Coal comes on the scene about 1865. It's a resource. We figured out how to extract that resource, and importantly, to use that resource to produce electricity. Steel's about 15% of global coal consumption, 85% is to produce electricity. Okay? Henry Ford comes on the scene, and all of a sudden, with the mass production of vehicles, combustion engine vehicles, there's a new need for oil. We were using oil in the late 1800s to make paraffin waxes and paint and Vaseline and other lubricants, but it was really the mass production of the combustion engine that all of a sudden went, ding dong, we need to find more oil so that we can produce gasoline or petrol for all of these vehicles. Natural gas comes on the scene. There was something we called town gas in the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s. We then figured out that natural gas could also be used to produce electricity. Okay? And when you look here, the y-axis is not important except to know that we have significantly increased our consumption of each of these fossil fuels over the last 120 years. Okay? Then we had hydroelectric. Okay, so hydroelectric, Niagara Falls, okay, the first large-scale hydroelectric power plant that was built for the purpose of generating electricity. electricity. Nuclear comes on the scene. Nuclear was essentially developed by the Defense Department at Idaho National Labs and a few other installations so that you could have submarines that wouldn't have to come to the surface, combust diesel engine to charge batteries so you could sink below the surface. So nuclear was invented so subs could run silent and run deep for longer than the mechanical lifetime of the submarines. Okay? But importantly here, nuclear and hydroelectric in our lifetimes seem to have tapped out unless there is a new invention, small-scale modular nuclear reactors, okay? Which I'm not going to get into. Without a doubt, not political, not dependent on who you pray to or if you pray, without a doubt, the black lines here are the same I've shown in the last several slides. Okay? So for oil and coal and natural gas, okay, we have been using those for 100 plus years. The red line and the right y-axis is an indication of the carbon that is the direct result of the chemical combustion of those fossil fuels. It is what it is. And so we know now that all of that carbon that is the result of combustion of coal and natural gas and oil, it ends up in the atmosphere. And there used to be this concept, dilution is the solution to pollution, right? The atmosphere is infinitely vast, and so it will dilute all of this carbon, and we now know that that's untrue, that the atmosphere is connected everywhere. So dilution is not the solution to pollution. We know that when you put more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere warms up. And it doesn't matter who puts the carbon dioxide there. We know that it happens, okay? It's an inevitable consequence of putting that there. So now we have the last source of energy down here, renewables. And in the news all the time now is something called the Green New Deal. And there's been an interest in renewables since prior to the Green New Deal. So that's simply the latest attempt politically to capitalize or to convince constituents of the need to push for more renewables. So when I looked at the Green New Deal when it first came out, I thought this is fantastic. And mining companies around the world are going to be overjoyed. Because as I want to show you in the next few minutes, the only way for the Green New Deal, not just in the United States, but globally, the only way for it to work, or the only ways for it to work, is one, you have to have the resources available to build the infrastructure, to produce electricity, and to allow for transportation. So you need the resources, which means that mining companies, those who are primarily responsible for finding those resources, we have to assess whether or not those resources are available in different volumes of Earth around the world to actually supply enough material for the Green New Deal to be feasible. Okay? So the big question for the Green New Deal is, can you take this growth of renewables down here at the bottom and actually have that rise rapidly enough that it displaces oil, coal, and natural gas? And how fast can that happen? Okay? So I'm going to focus only on copper. And I'm going to use copper as an example, but you can think here of copper as the example for rare earth elements that we need for wind turbines, okay? For gallium and other metals that we need for solar panels. And so if you take a snapshot of everything in our lives, copper is embedded somewhere, somehow making everything work for us. So if we go back to the dawn of the Copper Age, thousands of years ago, the x-axis here is only from 1900, forecasted out to about 2050. From the dawn of the Copper Age until 1945, okay, just about the end of World War II, all of the copper that humans extracted for all of those thousands of years was about 20% of the copper that humans used only from the period 1945 to 1995. So once Levittown and automobiles and telephones and everything else that we invented and needs copper, once that became commonplace, we significantly increased demand for copper around the world. So we increased from 1945 to 1995, we used 4 times as much copper as we had used since the dawn of the Copper Age. The forecasted consumption for copper out to 2050 is between 1 and 300% of the copper we've ever used. So you got to take all the copper we've used since the dawn of the copper age and double or triple, or some suggest quadruple that amount of copper. Right? So the Green New Deal also requires a lot of copper. Do we have enough? Will we run out? If you look at media reports, they often cast this as how many years are left. So for copper, the number of years left as of right now is about 40 years. But that's based on the amount of copper we know exists in the ground right now. Geologists have found it. And at today's copper price, companies can physically extract that copper and sell it. Which means there's a lot more copper that we've found, but at today's copper price, no company could profitably extract the copper and make it available for society. So when you see these reports of copper has 40 years left, we're going to run out, it's important to know that that 40 years has been about the same for 100 years. So if we go back to 1900 here, minus the two blips on the radar here, in 1900 we had about 50 years left. In 1950 we had about 60 years left. In 2000 we had about 32 years left. 2010 we had about 36 years left. And at current copper prices, we have about 39 years left. So when you hear the media say we're running out, or the one that I fast-forwarded over, when you have scientists and economists who bet one another that we're going to run out of resources and the world is going to end, Armageddon is upon us, it's not true. Economic geologists have done a phenomenal job at exploring for and identifying volumes of rock around the world that contain anomalous concentrations of copper relative to the rock in my backyard or your backyard. And the amount of that copper that we quantify as a reserve is dependent on the dollars per pound of copper. As the price of copper goes up, the total reserves of copper go up. As the price of copper decreases, the total reserves of copper decrease. So when you hear things like the resource curse, Armageddon, we're going to run out, for copper it hasn't been true since we started tracking those metrics. And the same is true for all other metals. So in your own backyard, renewables now are becoming more important. So I've been teaching here for 8 summers, and my first few years, Mark Barron was your mayor. And Mark used to talk about how he and Jackson and Teton County used some of the stimulus money during the Obama administration to figure out how they could build a renewable energy infrastructure in Jackson and also improve energy efficiency to reduce costs for the city. Simple things like, instead of a police car that's idling, have a police car with 2 separate batteries. So one battery operates or is used to operate the engine to start it. The other battery operates all the electronics. And so this is a snapshot top left of my class a few weeks ago down at your wastewater treatment plant, which you all pay for, where they've used solar to reduce the electricity consumption by about 90%. And the people around here, so Johnny Ziem on the right works for the town of Jackson. He's also in charge of the wastewater treatment plant. And bottom left is a guy named Phil Cameron, who runs something called Energy Conservation Works, which was a nonprofit started when Mark Barron was still mayor. So we've got solar, and the reason we have solar is that it's reducing the need for the wastewater treatment plant to buy electricity from Lower Valley Energy, even as ridiculously cheap as it is. So our electricity is about 15 cents a kilowatt hour. You're paying 5.6 last year? I would love to have that. With 4 kids, well, 3 kids at home, I would love to have that. Okay? So solar is being used here to displace electricity that previously had to be bought from the grid. And when I look at a solar panel, this is what I see as an economic geologist. I see all these countries, and I see all of these metals, all of which are required to build a solar infrastructure. And I always have students that somehow think they're going to go to the apple orchard or the peach orchard, and on that last row are solar panels that God has just allowed to grow from the new trees. But they don't. You need all of these resources in order to produce solar panels. And importantly, we need all of these countries to produce the resources that are required to produce solar panels. Wind has become big in Wyoming. Right? Wyoming is the only state that has a production tax on wind, which I'm totally for. I think it's fantastic. I think other states should do it because it's a resource generator which is necessary for K-12 schools and other public infrastructure. But in my 8 years in Wyoming, every year when we come out, we liaise with your governor's policy advisors. The thinking on wind has really changed over the last 8 years. But when I look at a wind turbine, I see the resources necessary for that wind turbine. And I start thinking, how many wind turbines do you need if you want to supply 50% of the United States electricity, 60% of our electricity, 70% of our electricity? You need the land, you need the buy-in from the landowners, and you need all the materials that make the wind turbines, right? The newest one now, called Choke Cherry, which is being built, 3,000 megawatt wind farm in south central Wyoming. They're going to run high voltage transmission lines to Las Vegas and tap into the market in Nevada, Arizona, and Southern California. And they can make a profit doing that, which is amazing. 8 years ago, no one would have thought you could do this profitably. Today, you can actually make a profit. And Wyoming, certainly at the governor's office, is now thinking about wind as an exportable resource. We don't need it all here, but could we build big enough turbine farms and then export that electricity to the people who want that, and they'll pay us for it? Okay? We look at offshore wind potential, it's phenomenal. And even the Trump administration recognizes this. So behind the scenes, the Trump administration has been promoting offshore wind development. In December 2016, a Norwegian company got the first contract to build a 1 gigawatt floating wind farm off New York. New York has a mandate to produce more renewable electricity. The Norwegian company is among the best in the world at doing it. It's just far enough offshore that when you're sitting and sunning, you don't see those turbines. And all of that electricity just comes on lines right on the bottom of the ocean to dry land. And the Trump administration is looking at this as a resource, ultimately, that can be taxed, that can provide benefit to society. But again, when you look at wind turbines, you need all the resources in bold. And those are all the countries where we extract those resources. They don't grow in trees. So again, mining companies look at this and say, fantastic. You want to build 1 million turbines, 2 million turbines, 3 million turbines? China wants 1 million turbines. Russia wants 1 million turbines. Germany wants 1 million turbines. Great. Because we're the companies that can find these resources and make them available to you. The fundamental reason that wind and solar are being built at such a rapid rate today is that they are now without any tax subsidies. None. Without any tax credits, without any tax subsidies. If you look at utility scale solar and utility scale wind on a per megawatt hour basis, wind and solar are cheaper than gas peaking plants, than nuclear, than coal, and gas combined cycle. So energy companies, energy producers look at this, and I always say to students, we have a business school. Like if you're a businessman and you're going to build a new plant to provide electricity, and you have options, and you know that the electricity you sell, you're going to sell at 10 cents a kilowatt hour, then your choice is, what fuel do you use to produce the electricity? I could use wind, I could use solar, I could use coal, I could use nuclear, I could use natural gas. Right now, without any subsidies whatsoever, wind and solar, if you can combine those with battery technology, are cheaper than all other ways of generating electricity. So purely from a thoroughbred business capitalist perspective, I've never had a student tell me they wouldn't choose wind or solar and batteries. So this is the reason that they're being adopted. And they're being adopted in places you would never think. So the bottom is a map of the 2016 presidential results. And the red states that voted for Trump, the blue states that voted for Clinton. And all I want you to take away on this is that when you look at the top map, and you look at these states in the Midwest, okay, including Wyoming, they're the states that are far and away building and producing more wind energy electricity, except for California. And they're doing it not because the people there are huge proponents of renewables. In fact, it's the opposite. Public opinion surveys, if you canvass, if you go to Kansas or Oklahoma, or parts of Texas, and you go knock door to door, and you ask people, are they for or against renewable energy? The majority of people say they're against it. But the reason that they're now using more renewable energy is that their energy providers have realized that by building wind energy and making that available, it has decreased their cost increases, so it's cheaper. And at the end of the day, everyone wants cheaper. If you can buy the same two products, and my product is 10 cents a kilowatt hour and yours is 9 cents a kilowatt hour, everybody's going to go with the 9 cents a kilowatt hour. So renewables, because of the cost, are really taking off. And if we think about a future with more electric vehicles, okay, no fossil fuels involved, and we think about your local future, where you have now bought 2 all-electric buses that will soon start operating here in Jackson to ferry people around downtown Jackson. This is at the START facility, literally around the corner, whichever way the corner is, over here. And we visit there every year for a few hours, and it's phenomenal. And the engineers and all the guys and gals that work there, they're really impressed, because in their lifetime, batteries have evolved from, they wouldn't have worked 20, 30 years ago to make a bus move around Jackson. It was too cold, the battery technology wasn't good enough, you didn't have enough charge, you couldn't charge them fast enough when you drained the battery. These are buses now that can charge in a matter of a few tens of minutes. Whole-scale buses. And every one of those buses takes a lot more copper than the diesel buses we use today, or the diesel-electric buses we use today. Okay? So when mining companies look at the projected penetration rate for electric vehicles, they love it, because it means more copper, more rare earth elements, more gold, more silver, more of all the other metals that have to be mined in order to allow for the increased production of electric vehicles. If we were to imagine a world where we replaced the 235 million combustion engine passenger vehicles in the United States with all EVs. Right? And again, this is for a hybrid car, but this is just a snapshot. When you drive a Prius or a Nissan Leaf, okay, this is what you're driving. You're driving all of these resources from all of these countries, all over the world, and all of those resources get aggregated by companies who produce the vehicle. So it's truly a global process. Okay? Batteries used to be a big challenge for renewable energy. But a couple of years ago, Tesla built what they call the Tesla Mega Battery. And that Mega Battery sits on site of a large wind farm near Adelaide in South Australia. And its demand response time is better than the best gas peaker plants on the planet. And so they were able to recover the initial investment in 2 years. Their initial investment for that battery infrastructure, 2 years in, they recovered, paid it off. So again, the economics are the fundamental driver for renewable energy around the world. We need to upgrade the electricity transmission grid. And this is in the news a lot also. You know, it's going to be unbelievably expensive. But again, if you want to upgrade the grid, what do we need? We need more steel. We need more aluminum for high voltage transmission lines. We need more copper when we step down that high voltage, the voltage that we use in our houses. So all of it means more resources. In the United States, we don't produce most of those resources. So here you're looking at, for a variety of resources, and they're small, I apologize, and the countries from which we source them. And these countries up here, or these resources up here, we import 100% of everything we use, 100%. So there is increasingly now a huge concern in Washington, D.C., and in 2018, the U.S. Congress actually passed a new regulation that the United States Geological Survey do more exploration to understand what resources we might have available within the United States, considering that most of these resources we import at 100% are the backbone for our modern technological infrastructure. So how do we ensure a sustainable supply of resources for our growing global society? Right? I'll tell you, we're not going to run out. Certainly not in the near term, not my kids, not my grandkids. So how do we do that? Well, I'll first let you know that we can't recycle our way there. So this is a snapshot of the periodic table. And all of the elements in blue, we currently globally recycle them at greater than 50%. Right? An atom of copper doesn't care if it's in a car or a phone or an electric line. So we recycle some of these elements well, but if you look at, for example, all of these rare earth elements on the bottom row, okay, we recycle less than 1%. So we can't recycle our way there. But we do have to do a much better job at figuring out how to recycle all of these metals. Once we embed them into technology products, how do we get them out? We have to mine. Right? There's no other way you can do this. And the options are, we all get naked and go live in a cave somewhere. Be happy with that. Or we have to mine our way to the infrastructure that is economic now, and that most people seem to want, even if they don't say they want it, because it keeps their costs lower than our traditional infrastructure does now. You have to mine it. Okay? It used to be easy to mine. We tripped over the things that we mine. And if we go back to the gold rush, California, 1848, 49, you literally would walk around and you would trip over gold placer deposits that were just sitting right there. Right? It's like, as if God, at the end of the seventh day, she said, hey, wait a minute, I'm going to put some gold right next to the riverbed so people can see it. It would just sit right there. You could pick it up. We can't do this now. Okay? If we go back to one of my favorite big holes in the ground, Bingham Canyon, just outside of Salt Lake City. Okay? Since 1890, it's produced 22 million tons of copper. Okay? We tripped over that, the collective we. Union Army soldiers literally tripped over mineralization in the form of lead and zinc. And then they followed that uphill and they found, wait, the lead and zinc become copper and gold and molybdenum. What if we start digging into the ground? And they found lots more of it. And so today we have this giant open pit that's the result of that exploration, but tripping over resources at the surface. Since 1900, which is roughly when Bingham Canyon went into production, this now is the depth. So we would stand right up here. So it's the depth into Earth as a function of time starting in 1900 for a variety of different resources. And what we've observed is that we are now having to go deeper and deeper to find the resources that we consume. So the copper that we used to trip over at the surface, the gold that we used to trip over at the surface, we don't trip over it anymore. We are now, in the mining industry, increasingly borrowing technology from oil and gas, stuff that you guys and gals perfected decades ago, seismic and other methods. We're now having to rely on things when we go into places like sub-Saharan Africa, which is completely forested. Now, how do you find an ore deposit in a completely forested area? What do? You need some technology that sees through the forest. So we can look at ore deposits that contain copper or tin or gold, and almost ubiquitously, they contain the mineral magnetite, and magnetite is a natural magnet. So now what we're doing over the last several decades is we're flying these aerial surveys over Brazil and Chile and Ghana, and we're looking through forest, through the soil, into the rock below the soil. We're looking for the magnetic response that can be an indicator of the potential for an ore deposit enriched in copper or gold or tin or silver to be there. Okay? So technology now is what we're using because we don't trip over these deposits. Here's just an indication of an area in Ghana where the reds are magnetic highs, so rock below the surface that's got a lot of magnetism, and then blues and yellows and greens where it's weakly magnetic or not magnetic at all. And so through that thick forest cover, economic geologists are able to say, okay, I'm going to go here, but I'm not going to go there. Right? So we're trying to find the needle in the haystack. We can take these now and go from two-dimensional to three-dimensional maps. Again, something that oil and gas has been doing for decades. But economic geologists now are increasingly doing this. It becomes the bread and butter. How do we actually build 3D maps of the subsurface so that we know what potential resources might be there? We're using satellites. So this is just a snapshot where the colors are an indication of one particular mineral on the surface of the Earth that would take weeks to months for humans to walk around and map. But now we can use satellites that can fly over in a matter of seconds to minutes and tell us what minerals we have on the surface, which we can then use as a vector for a potential ore deposit that might exist beneath the surface. We, the collective we, have gotten really good at this. So the last few slides here. This is an area where economic geologists have used these and other technologies to find a volume of earth which is known as the Pebble Prospect or the Pebble Project in south central Alaska. Okay? And this is what it looks like today as a photograph in the bottom. So that's what you see. It's not a mine, it's a prospect. It's a volume of earth that contains, as I'll show you, a phenomenal quantity of copper and gold and molybdenum and silver. And we've used these technologies, like the magnetic responsive rocks, to hone in on exactly that spot, that dot on the surface of the earth, where we can do more exploration on the ground by drilling into the subsurface and extracting the rocks to see what's there. And the result is that all of these colors here, these reds and oranges and yellow, they're an indication of what percentage of the rock in the subsurface is copper. And there's a lot of copper here, a lot of copper below the surface. And this is a schematic, so a cross-section. Imagine you're trenching into the subsurface, where they have outlined the shape of open pits identical to Bingham Canyon. So the gray here would be a 25-year dig, and then the red, okay, the black here would be 45 years, and then 78 years from the time a shovel first started digging, that would be the size of the pit. Okay? This has been ongoing for 30 years from the time that exploration first started in this part of Alaska for this deposit. 30 years later, we now know how much copper is there, and we know what the shape of the pit would look like. And just to give you a sense of how big that deposit could be if it went into production, it would be the largest gold deposit on the planet. And it would be the 5th largest copper deposit on the planet. Well, wind turbines, every one of them, needs about 9,000 pounds of copper. Every solar panel needs copper and gold. So when I heard Green New Deal, I thought, this is amazing. We're finally going to get the social license from liberals who are anti-mining to mine the resources to make their proposed Green New Deal our collective reality. Because that's what it would take. Okay? But it's not that easy. So their proposal is 100% renewable energy by 2030. That can't be done. And that can't be done simply based on the life cycle of mining. So even at a mine like Pebble, okay, if it were to become a mine, it's at least a decade before they physically take copper and put it in somebody's hand. So on average, for most copper deposits, most gold deposits, from the time we go from coffee in the morning back at home base and decide to go to Alaska and explore and find a deposit and get the permits and dig a hole in the ground and extract that copper, it is never less than 10 years. And it's on average 20 years, which is a nightmare for mining companies because that's all negative cash flow that they're having to borrow from investors who want to know that there's going to be a return on that investment. So simply the life cycle tells us that by 2030 we can't do it. But in order to do it, we have to extract the copper in these volumes of earth where we found it. Now, it starts to get challenging. So if you go to Pebble, it sits upstream of one of the world's most pristine salmon fisheries. And I love salmon. Love it. I go to Costco and I love to buy wild salmon from Alaska. It looks better, it is better, tastes better, it's all better. Okay? Way better than the Atlantic salmon grown in the Pacific Ocean these days. But there are huge problems. Okay? This is one that's been in the news because the EPA, there's a lot of reports of collusion between the EPA and environmental groups in Alaska. They haven't been able to get the permit. They've spent $1 billion, they found the deposit, they know how much is there, they can't get the social license for that deposit. And if you can't mine that deposit, you can't build the wind turbines and you can't build the solar panels that you need for the Green New Deal. It just doesn't work. You just can't make it happen. If you find the orchard where I can pick it, I want to know. Okay? Send me a text or get my email from John, because I'll be second in line behind you with a basket, and I'll be throwing the copper and throwing the gold in there. And we'll have a really good time. Okay? So the Green New Deal presents challenges because it requires that we mine our way to the Green New Deal. There's just no other way to get there. Can't do it. Okay? So it's social license, something that psychologists and sociologists study. Social license is the limiting factor for the Green New Deal. It's not geology. It's convincing people that we need to extract the resources, that we need to mine in order to build the infrastructure that they propose. But we have too much NIMBYism, myself included, not in my backyard. And increasingly now, there's the NAMBYism, not in anybody's backyard, which is just absolutely preposterous, because I've never met a person naked walking around who lives in a cave. They're always wearing resources, and those resources were mined by somebody, and they were put together by somebody, and they're sold by somebody. Okay? So this is really what is going to hold back the Green New Deal. We have enough copper. So if we look at all of the copper that folks at the U.S. Geological Survey have told us is in the ground, meaning geologists have physically gone there. They've done due diligence. They know in that volume of earth how much copper is there. And they know if copper is $1 a pound, here's how much you can extract profitably. If copper is $2 a pound, you can extract more copper profitably. If it's $3 a pound, mining companies are overjoyed because they can get more copper out of the ground, meaning that they can extract rock that has lower concentrations. So when we look at how much copper we know exists, right? 1,236 million tons in 2010. It's there. We just don't yet have the social license to allow mining companies to get permitted to extract it. Right? So I'll borrow a phrase from a colleague of mine who used this. People want change, people don't want to change. Okay? That's what limits us. We want the change until it requires us to change. That's the hardest thing, for me included. Front and center. Okay? So the last, I very promised you the last few slides. Okay? What do we then do for the other 7 billion people around the world who don't have what we got? Okay? So every summer I go to Ghana, and we have started a STEM capacity building program in Accra, Ghana, the capital city. And we now have about 150 young adults, college students, senior level high school students. From this year we had students from Senegal, Ivory Coast, Liberia, Togo, Benin, Ghana, Nigeria, and I'm probably missing a country, okay? And they all come, and the reason they come is that we have developed a STEM program that is hands-on. One of the things that we observed, a friend of mine was in the Peace Corps in Ghana, is that the K-16 curriculum in most of Africa is hands-off. So the way that they teach classes, even like chemistry or physics or biology, is students sit, students listen, students regurgitate. They never dissect frogs, they don't dissect cats, they don't do electromagnetic experiments in physics. And we wanted to create a program where students could come in and actually get their hands dirty and do science. Because as the father of 4 kids, I think my wife would completely agree with me, and everybody here would agree. When you do something, that's when you engage with something. When you do science, when you do anything, when you get your hands dirty, right? You become more passionate about that and you learn better. So I go here every summer, and it's fantastic for me because it's an annual wake-up call to how blessed I am to live the lifestyle that I am afforded to live in the United States, and how blessed my kids are. And when I'm there, every morning I take a pill so I don't get malaria. Every morning. Right? Every single morning. I don't drink any water because dysentery is rampant. So even in the shower, the water never goes above my neck because I am paranoid of getting water into my system and then getting what they call runny belly, which is so commonplace that only white people mention that term. But everybody has it. Right? We get to visit places, and this is actually probably my favorite excursion when I was there, if that's going to play. We'll see. Where we got to meet people making kente cloth. And if you've ever seen kente cloth, it's this really bright cloth. Notorious women in Ghana and East and Sub-Saharan Africa wear it. And we got to see how they weave it and how they make it. Truly amazing. Skills that are dying in the U.S. Okay? We always take students with us. If I could force every undergraduate in the United States, University of Wyoming, University of Michigan, wherever it may be, I would love to force them to have to go somewhere for a semester where they have less than where they came from. so they can see the world through the eyes of people less fortunate, which ultimately then I think would allow us to improve the condition of people around the world who do lack what we have, that we take for granted, because if we don't know, we don't know. Okay? I was fortunate to have a student who came from Liberia, Daniel Corfei, and he earned his master's degree at the University of Michigan in 2014 and 2016. And my wife and I always recount meeting him. He flew from Liberia to Michigan December 29th. That's not a good time to leave sub-Saharan Africa. Okay? And we were out of town, so we booked him Red Roof Inn. He took a taxi from the airport to Red Roof Inn. All right, this is Michigan, December 29th. It's cold. And it's like Jackson, it's cold. We show up 2 days later. The first words out of his mouth, I said, you know, we corresponded. How you doing? And he said, I've been held hostage. I was like, oh shit, what do you mean? Like somebody held you hostage? You know, he couldn't leave the room. He was so cold. He couldn't leave the room. All he would do was go to the concession area in the hotel. Right? And then one of the things that my wife reminded me of is we moved him into an apartment on campus. And a couple of things. I remember he moved in with a roommate who was not clean. The first thing my wife is looking for is a dustpan, a broom. It's disgusting. Like it was a bachelor pad, worst you could possibly imagine. And there's a microwave. And I remember getting a microwave about 1984, and all it had was a turn dial. That was it. And so all you could do is put something in the microwave, you turn the dial, and then it would work, and you pop the popcorn and whatnot. But today, microwaves are phenomenal. Microwaves today, my kids have to operate them for me, because it's got so many buttons, and it's just like, all I want to do is just cook something. That's it. So there's a microwave. And I think, Alicia, you might have asked him, you might have pointed out, here's a microwave. He had never seen one. Never seen one, let alone used one. Something that everybody today, right? You go into a modern kitchen, microwave's above the stove. We just have one. Every college dorm on average has a microwave. And he said, what did he say? He said, I've never used it, but if you give me a manual, I'll teach myself. And I get goosebumps when I say that. Like, here was this kid, he was like my wake-up call. And then we took him to the grocery store, and he had never seen bread that came in plastic bags pre-sliced. He wanted mayonnaise. He had never been to a store that had more than one type of mayonnaise. He had never been to a store that had the abundance of cheese that we have. And so he was great for a lot of reasons for the 2 years that he was with us. But I also know that in his home country, over here, right, roughly 1 out of 4 people in that country have access to sometimes electricity. 3 out of 4 have no access to electricity. And I get pushback from students sometimes, like, well, do you really think they want electricity? Let's break this down. Because what is electricity? Electricity means plumbing. Electricity means clean water, because you can clean the water to supply it to society. Electricity means lights at night. Domestic violence goes down. Rape and incest go down. This has been well studied. Electricity means you flush the toilet, and just like it does here, it goes in that direction. And they purify it using solar to produce the electricity needed, and then they put that into the Snake River, where the other day on a rafting trip I jumped in, and I didn't have to worry about getting dysentery from all the toilet water being flushed in Jackson. Right? And so you look at a map here of Africa, and I've sort of titled, or I think of this slide as like opportunities for electrification. So for me, the Green New Deal is fantastic, but I also think about it globally, because around the world there are more than 1 billion people who have no access to electricity. None. And all the things that go with electricity, not a Tesla, but the simple things that go with electricity. Right? Do you know how to use a microwave? If you give me a manual, I'll teach myself. So when I was there a few weeks ago, the university we partner with is the first in Africa to now have a curriculum for renewable energy. And this is the first solar field that they've built. And then there's battery storage off here on the left. And when I was talking to the provost, we were talking about why. Why are you going to do this? And he said, well, we don't have coal-fired power plants. We don't have natural gas-fired power plants. We can't afford nuclear. There's no way. Can't afford nuclear and wait 10 years for a nuclear power plant to be built. So we're looking for the low-hanging fruit. So we've evaluated in sub-Saharan Africa what is the cheapest way to provide electricity, and to do it as fast as we can do it. And for them, solar and battery is that most economical way to do it. So for him, he's not anti-coal, it's not political. He's not anti-gas, it's not political. He's not anti-hydraulic fracturing. He's looking at it from the perspective of, we're a poor country, we know how much money we have, we know how much land we have. This is a resource we can afford, and we can then deploy around Ghana so that we can provide the electricity that we see the rest of the world have, and we see all of those things that go along with that. Decreased maternal mortality, decreased child mortality, all of those things that we're blessed to have. Even medical complications that we had when Alicia was giving birth to a couple of our children. We were in a hospital where we had first world medical service. They don't have that, and so they need the electricity to get there. So for me, the Green New Deal is bigger. It's really bigger. And we have to have the social license to allow mining companies to find the resources, dig a hole in the ground, and extract those resources, not just for us and our grandkids, but I think it's our moral imperative we have to do it for the whole world. And the very last slide. We have to do it because we do it better, we do it safer, we have a better EPA, we have a better Mine Safety Hazard Administration. We can't allow the resources for the Green New Deal to come on the backs of child labor in places like the Democratic Republic of Congo. We have to do it here. And this is something that's a really hard pill for the people behind the Green New Deal to swallow, but they have to do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. And it was a great talk, and I wish there were time for questions, but there are not. There is not. So...
That's my fault.
No.
No, it is my fault.
So Adam,